Change my way of thinking, make myself a difference and a rule.
Okay, well, good morning. Well, it's good morning here, and good part of the day to wherever you are. Now, this is the second video in a series of videos, which is going to be about depression, but also about the wisdom of living a happy life. I've started off with the first video, which was a simple kind of description of the symptoms of depression, because I really wanted to make sure that what we were talking about was not just unhappiness, that we were thinking about it in terms of it being an illness and what that meant. So the first talk is quite simple, but we're now starting to build on it, and this one is going to be much more complicated, a lot more science, and there's going to be a few concepts that I need to convince you of before we can really move on and then think about the more wisdom applications, the wisdom of living a happy life. And well, I suppose actually I've used the word happiness there, and I really want to move to, in a few talks time maybe, to talking about the difference between depression, the difference between happiness, and the difference between joy. Ultimately, of course, the aim will be a joyful life, as happiness is so transient. But I want to recap, just in case you didn't see the first one, or in case you didn't absorb the messages, that I want you to think about the brain as being an egg. Imagine an egg and in your hand, and you know that the center of the egg is the yolk and the outside is the white. When we talk about heart and mind in our lives, we tend to really mean sort of thinking and feeling. And in terms of brain anatomy, the heart is much more analogous to the yolk of the egg. It's the central part, and it's what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system, when it goes wrong, can produce all sorts of problems, but in particular, depression or depressive illness is one of the things that we're going to be concerned about. But the connection between the limbic system and the rest of the brain is very, very important. I'm going to add to this now. If you think about the yolk, not the yolk, but the whole of the egg as kind of being attached to a stick. That stick is now the spinal cord going down your back. And at the very top, where the stick joins the egg, is what's called the brainstem. And we are going to be talking about how the brainstem is implicated in depression. Now, bear with me. This is relevant. It's relevant to thinking about everyday life. So I'm going to try and sell you a whole series of, you're going to be not only neuroanatomists at the end of this talk, you'll be neurologists and psychiatrists and psychologists. What I'm trying to develop is a theory of the mind that includes every experience you've ever had, and also your internal biology. So let's kind of take it to the next level, which is, you've heard the saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, kind of all pathways of depression end up with the brain. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the final pathway, as all the pathways join and intersect, you end up with only one pathway, and that is the physical functioning of the brain. So no matter what pathway has led you to depression, and that could be childhood trauma, it could be a series of negative events in your adult life, it could be family history, it could be brain injury or illness. It could be all these things. But at the end of the day, no matter how psychological in origin, perhaps even spiritual in origin, or how physical in origin, at the end of the day, the final common pathway that leads you to experiencing depression, and remember, by depression, I mean a pervasive, pathologically lowered mood. So it's a mood that affects every aspect of your life, and it's prolonged as well. So it's pervasive, prolonged, and pathological. So It's much lower than a normal unhappiness. It affects every aspect of your life, and it doesn't really vary. It goes on over time. And so to get that sort of mood shift into depression means your brain is not working properly. So that's the final common pathway. Now, I want you to understand that whilst I'm saying the final common pathway is physical, I do not mean that necessarily depression is caused by the physical problem. I just mean that the expression of it has to be physical, because ultimately all our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are expressed through our nervous system, and the nervous system functions in this way. Electrical signals travel along electrical wires called neurons. They're just like electrical wires in the brain, and they stop at a junction, which is called a synapse. And at that stop, when the electrical impulse gets to it, it releases chemicals, neurochemicals. So it's just a chemical, and that's a signal, and that crosses the little gap called the synapse, and then it triggers a receptor on the other side, which is another neuron, and then it triggers another electrical symbol. So, not symbol, message. And so basically that's how the brain works. It's a series of electrical and chemical signals. Now, fundamentally, the problem with depression is problems with, we think, the chemicals. Other diseases, the fundamental problem is with the electrical wiring. For example, multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a problem with the electrical wiring, nothing to do with the signals. But depression is somewhat different. So I wanted you to understand that. So I want you to understand that that depression ultimately, I am saying, is a physical illness, but it's a psychosomatic physical illness. It means that it has its, often it'll have origins in our psychological experience, but it will be ultimately expressed in an abnormality of brain function. It is probably one of the best examples would be, it's a little bit like blood pressure. We all know that blood pressure has a normal range, and then it can go too high. And if it goes too high, it causes all sorts of illnesses, from strokes to heart attacks. But what you may not know is that most problems with blood pressure have a stress relation. It's related to your life. So, I mean, yes, you can get blood pressure from kidney disease, and that would be an example of a specific physical condition causing blood pressure problems. But so 80% of high blood pressure is related to the way we live our lives. It can be what we eat, what we drink, and stress in our lives. So it's a stress-related condition. And similarly, depression is like that. There are plenty of physical causes of depression, but primarily physical, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but also there's tons of psychological ones. So what you have is this psyche-soma relationship. That's what psychosomatic means. It means psyche to do with the mind, and soma to do with the body, psyche-soma. And it doesn't mean that it's made up. People say, oh, it's a psychosomatic illness, it's made up. No. Psychosomatic illnesses, which actually most illnesses are psychosomatic, that means they have an element to do with the mind and an element to do with the body. Which is why if you want to get on top of blood pressure, you can't just do it by taking pills. And maybe you need to start thinking about changing your diet, you need to think about exercising, you need to think about changing your life. And similarly with depression, actually, some of the treatments for depression are going to be very similar. You can have to look at everything. Ultimately, what I'm saying is depression is caused by stress, because I'm going to define stress as a challenge that requires a response. So any challenge that requires a response and demands change is a stress. Now, clearly, you're thinking, see, some of these things can't be bad. And you'd be absolutely right. There are loads of stresses that are a challenge in our lives that demand a change, which are fantastic. Going on holiday is a challenge which demands change, which brings some stress. but the stress is not necessarily bad, but you need to recognize that it could be stressful depending what type of holiday you're going on and what happens when you're on holiday. Getting married, having children, getting promoted, getting a pay rise. All these things are challenges that require a response in our lives. They all lead to a response, a change in behavior, a change in attitude, but they're all stressful. But being bereaved, being divorced, having a relationship breakup, experiencing trauma, particularly sexual trauma, getting physically ill, being injured, all these things are negative stresses. Interestingly, when it comes to causing depression, what research has shown is it's actually more the amount of stress rather than the type of stress that's important. So if you have a bereavement in 1 year and you get married and you get promoted and then you get an illness, it's not that they cancel each other out. The good things don't cancel the bad things out. They're actually summative. They add up. So the more challenge in your life that requires a change, the more likely you are to get depressed. That's something research has shown. It's almost proportional. Maybe we need to have a little, I'll give you some physical examples as well of how things in life affect the brain function. So I talked to you about how the brain works in terms of you get an electrical signal down an electrical wire, it hits the end, and that releases some chemicals that cross a junction called a synapse, and that creates a signal. Right, well, imagine in the limbic system, which is the yolk of the egg, that's your brain. Your brain is an egg, limbic system is the yolk, and the yolk is the part that we call the heart. It's the heart of your life. It's to do with, particularly to do with mood. Imagine that's not working so well. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the electrical signals that are going through your limbic system hit the synapse, the junction, and it wants to release some neurochemicals. Now, there are three main ones. They're called monoamines, but there's three main ones. A couple of them you might have heard of. So one's dopamine, one is serotonin or 5-hydroxytryptamine, and one is noradrenaline. Now, everyone's heard of adrenaline. Noradrenaline is chemically related to it and does very similar things in the brain. So adrenaline's to do with excitement, and so is noradrenaline. Noradrenaline's to do with excitement. Dopamine, you might have heard of in terms of Parkinson's disease, and that's because the brain is a bit complicated, and it uses the same neurochemicals to do different things in different parts of the brain. So in one part of the brain, dopamine regulates movement. And so if your dopamine reduces in an area of the brain that's to do with movement, then you can't move easily, and you have a problem with stiff muscles, and you can't actually initiate movement, which is part of Parkinson's disease, and you can also get tremor. You've got no stable platform to move from. But in another part of the brain, dopamine is to do with pleasure and reward, particularly anticipated pleasure. So it's particularly associated with things like, well, thinking about something pleasurable about to happen to you or going to happen to you, that would be dopamine. So if you are at work and you're thinking about your forthcoming holiday and you've booked it and you're going to go to Seychelles and you're going to go windsurfing and you're thinking about the beach and the cocktails and your mood is going up because you're getting quite excited about it, that's dopamine. It's an anticipated reward. Dopamine is also when you go gambling or play roulette or pull on a fruit machine, and just in that time when the thing is spinning, whether it's the roulette wheel or whatever, and you think, oh, I could win the jackpot, and you have a little frisson of pleasure, that's dopamine. When dopamine is reduced in the limbic system, we tend to lose sense of pleasure. It's called anhedonia. It means we don't get any hedonism, we don't get any pleasure, and it's part of depression. It's not the whole story of depression, it's just part of it. So when noradrenaline doesn't work right, we often can get anxious. When dopamine doesn't work right, we don't get any pleasure. And the third chemical is serotonin, or 5-HT, which is one of the happy chemicals, particularly associated, you'll have heard of an antidepressant called Prozac, well, and SSRIs. All those family of antidepressants work on serotonin, but if serotonin goes low, then our mood drops. And we actually, that's more classically associated with feeling depressed, but also anxious as well. So if those electrical signals in the limbic system hit the synapse, and there isn't very much serotonin, or very much noradrenaline, or very much dopamine around to do the next signal, then we can experience these components of depression. Right, okay, so that's I've actually kind of explained the monoamine hypothesis of depression. What's interesting is that genetics plays a part here. So let's think about genetics. So polygenic inheritance, what does that mean? That means that we have been given a set of genes, and they control certain aspects of our potential. So, for example, my father was 5'11". His brother was 6'1", but my mother is 5'2", maybe 5'3", probably 5'2" now. She's a lot older, and her sister was even smaller, and her mother was pretty small. And one of her brothers is tall, and one of her brothers is much shorter. I am 5'7.5". So what's happened is that I've inherited a set of genes from my mother and father, and mixed up together, they have set my height. Now, if I'd lived in the Middle Ages, I'd be even shorter, because I wouldn't have been able to eat enough to reach my genetic potential for height. I think I've had plenty of food in my life. I've been given lots of nutrition. I've lived in a nice, stable environment, so I've hit my genetic potential for height. I could not grow any taller. There's a limit to it. Similarly, intelligence. Polygenetic inheritance to intelligence, but there is a limit. No matter how good your education or how good your family background, you can only get to a certain level of intelligence, and that's limited by your genes. Height and intelligence are really good examples of where you have a potential that you can reach, you can't go beyond it. But if you have adverse circumstances in your life, you will not even reach that potential. You will not hit it. Well, similarly with mood, actually, your ability to sustain good mood in the face of stress or challenge is limited by your genetic potential, because genes control things like the amount of monoamines, that's the serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, that are in your brain. They control the amount of receptors that are on the synapse that are sensitive to that signal. They control the absorption of the nutrients into your body that make these monoamines. Some people have phenomenally super strong inheritance in this area, and their temperament is super stable. You know, they're the kind of people that nothing seems to knock them off track. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we're all like that? But if we're all super stable, there is losses to society. We do need people to experience the ups and downs of life, because it's part of creativity, for example. But it's important for you to know that there's a genetic component, and some people are much more prone to experiencing depressed mood in the face of stresses. And it's because we haven't all been given the same genetic set of cards. We're not all equal. Some people can be very strong and physically fit and have fantastic reflexes, be a great table tennis player, but equally that same person could be very subject to stress-related mood swings, whereas somebody else might be rubbish at table tennis, but be fantastic at tolerating stress. We all have, nobody's got a perfect set of genes. Let's do maybe a case study example. Ernest Hemingway. You may not have read any of his stuff, but he's a famous writer. Particularly his hot period was in the mid-50s. Famous for writing books like For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea, Nobel Prize winning author. I just got a fly. I'm just waving at a fly, by the way. Nobel Prize winning author, but a phenomenally creative guy, considered to be one of the best writers in the last century, English-speaking writer. But what a life. I mean, and particularly what a mental health problem he had. He had a family history of mental health problems. There was suicide, that many members of his family suffered from suicide. His family background was rather severe and authoritarian, with an emphasis on manliness and being strong and achieving. Then he suffered 2 significant head injuries in his life. The second one in a plane crash, which led to a fractured skull, some degree of visual field damage in his brain, so he had some blindness, and cognitive problems. That meant that he had problems with his memory and cognition. He also was severely addicted to alcohol, so a heavy drinker. And he suffered from serious depression with multiple suicide attempts, and culminated in killing himself by putting a shotgun and shooting himself in the head with a shotgun. So he had a number of issues. So genetically, he probably inherited a set of cards with regard to mood stability, which was not particularly strong. Because of his family background, he really needed to prove himself, particularly to his father, and so he lived a life that was very stressful. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, for example. He sought out experiences which were dangerous, and he ended up having 2 head injuries as a result of some of his life choices. But the alcohol abuse, which is very common in people with depression, wouldn't have helped. Now, you see that interestingly, what alcohol does, why do people who suffer from mood swings, and particularly with depression, seem to turn to alcohol? Well, it's because alcohol temporarily relieves the depression, because it's a bit of an antidepressant. What it does is one of its actions, it's got many actions, but in the brain, it releases these monoamines, particularly serotonin, in the synapse. So basically what it does is it tells the brain, oh, squeeze out a load of happy chemical into the synapse to make us feel a little bit better. And we go, oh, we feel a little better. And we call it, we feel a bit drunk, a bit disinhibited, but significantly, if you've got a low mood, you feel better. Unfortunately, what you're doing is you're using up tomorrow's chemicals, tomorrow's happy chemicals today. So the next day, you feel even worse. In fact, people with serious depression can feel worse maybe 2 or 3 hours after drinking. So they get a very short-lived lift, and then it crashes down, and they can become quite suicidal. But part of a hangover is low mood. If you've had a real serious bender, like a lot of people last weekend with some of the release of the coronavirus lockdown, went a bit mad and drank loads and loads of booze, the next day you feel really quite low, as well as headachy and ill. But part of that is you've used up the brain's storage of happy chemicals, so you're going to have to wait until the brain builds them up a bit. So alcohol is a really interesting releaser of neurochemicals. Head injury causes real problems with the limbic system, because it can damage the limbic system function, and you can get post-concussion depression, post-head injury depression, post-depression mood swings, because it can disrupt the connection between the rest of the brain and the limbic system. But interestingly, Ernest Hemingway suffered from very high blood pressure, and he was on a drug called reserpine. Now, reserpine is not used anymore for treating blood pressure. It's considered a bit dangerous, and this is why. Because the way it works is it depletes the brain of dopamine. It reduces dopamine. Now, what did I say about dopamine? It was a chemical, one of the 3 monoamines, dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin. And dopamine's to do with pleasure. It also raises blood pressure in another part of the brain. It helps control blood pressure. So if you reduce dopamine, you do reduce blood pressure, which is why Ernest Hemingway was on it. But for somebody with a history of depression, it was a disastrous drug to be on, because it depleted his brain of dopamine and provoked and worsened his depression. And I think it was a significant factor in his suicide. today, if there was a coroner's inquest, I'm sure it would be heavily criticised that somebody with a history of suicide attempts and recurrent depression was on reserpine, a dreadful drug. So the purpose of that case study is to make you realise how much the brain is a machine, and it's a machine that also runs your heart. So your heart is a machine, the limbic system, and loads of things can affect it. Is it only physical things, I hear you ask? Oh, you're just a doctor, you're just going about physical stuff. Well, let's use another example. Trauma. We know that people who suffer from childhood deprivation or traumatic events are much higher risk of suffering from adult onset depression. So I kind of mean, this is the point about stress, by the way. Stress can come in two forms, you know, an overwhelming single event, or a kind of low-grade chronic situation, or a low-grade chronic situation that also has big events as well. It's a single episode of sexual abuse is enough to traumatize somebody and change the way they function for their adult lives. Similarly, though, chronic neglect, emotional neglect, and deprivation, so the kind of neglect that you might see in where there's a single parent who's suffering from illness, whether it's psychological illness or physical illness, and there's not enough money to run the household, and so, you know, the whole childhood experience is that of emotional and physical poverty and neglect. That kind of thing also is an ongoing stress and trauma which can affect the way the brain works. But what we do know is that serious traumatic events in childhood change the way the brain works. And this is one example of how this may work. I talked about the brainstem. So you've got the egg, and then the stick of the spine, the egg of the brain, the stick of the spinal cord, and where it joins the brainstem. In the brainstem is a bunch of blue cells, little cells, and when you look at them under a microscope, they're blue. And they're called the locus coeruleus, which literally means blue spot. And the locus coeruleus it's like a heartbeat of stress. It pulses, it goes poof, 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 at a regular rhythm. Now, in a normal healthy person, what it does, it's sending a pulse of electric signals up to the brain to alert the brain, and it fires off noradrenaline. Remember I said 3 monoamines that are implicated in depression. There's noradrenaline, dopamine, and serotonin. Well, we've done the dopamine story. This is the noradrenaline story. So it basically fires off these electrical signals into the brain, which releases noradrenaline, and it stimulates the brain to be alert. It's part of our awake cycle. It stops you falling asleep, and it's very important. If I pointed a gun at you, say I burst into you wherever let's say you're sitting in your dining room, you're having your tea, and I come in wearing a paramilitary uniform and a balaclava helmet, hat on, covering, and I pointed a gun at you, your locus coeruleus would go berserk. It would go boof, 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 and it would start beating away. And what it's doing is it's alerting the whole brain. It's the fight or flight. It's releasing noradrenaline all over your brain to say, panic, big threat. Then I pull my balaclava off and I squirt you in the face, and it's a water pistol, and we laugh, and you say, oh, Angus, you're such a joker. And your locus coeruleus goes, well, it might be you get angry with me, actually, but let's say you don't, you see the funny side. And I just had a water pistol, and there's no threat. And so your locus coeruleus then backs down, slows down, and you relax. However, if you'd had some childhood trauma, your locus coeruleus may be so traumatized, your brain, mind, whatever, is so traumatized by that event, particularly if it's very severe and at a certain developmental age, then permanently your locus coeruleus is firing faster than normal. So what your brain is now doing is saying, we must protect, we've experienced something horrible, we must never experience that again, we must be on the alert, we must be on our guard. And so it fires at a higher rate than a normal person who's never experienced trauma. And what you're doing is your brain is primed to look for threat. And what that means is that your mind, your thinking, is primed to look for threat. You would have a tendency to regard the world as a slightly dangerous, threatening place. And people who've had traumatic or abusive or neglected childhoods tend to be in this mindset. And they more easily see threat, they more easily see negativity, they more easily see stuff that is unpleasant, and they tend to disregard positive stuff. And what happens is that if a subsequent bad thing happens to a person who's like that, then the locus coeruleus accelerates off into the hyperspace, firing off threatening chemicals into the brain. And it takes ages to slow down again. It doesn't react. It's like it's overreacts constantly. And so it primes you for stuff like developing panic attacks, chronic anxiety, and chronic depression. And so you start getting more long-term, chronic, sorry, I used a technical word. Chronic means long-term, more long-term symptoms. And yet it's this mind-body interaction. It's been caused by a psychological event, but then future psychological events will be more likely to be experienced as negative because of the way the brain has now been set. So what you have is this psyche-soma relationship. Okay, so let's see, we've done physical insults, we've done stress. Now, all these things lead to, if you've had previous physical insults, if you've had previous psychological insults, it tends to reduce our resilience. Now, this is an important concept. Resilience is our ability to ride and cope with stress. So some people are very resilient. I talked about that at the beginning of the talk, that genetically, we can be very resilient. Our temperament can be very resilient. But equally, we can be resilient because we've not experienced anything negative. We've had a privileged, safe upbringing. Nothing's ever gone wrong. We've just experienced lots of success. But our resilience can be hit if we start to experience negative events in our adult lives. And the more negativity we experience, the more we start to become less resilient. And resilience often goes down as we get older. So things that we can cope with when we're very young in terms of, say, work stress. Work-related depression is a really, really common thing, particularly in certain professions. And what people often say is, well, I was fine in my 20s and my 30s, but I can't seem to do it anymore in my 40s. And there is an age-related decline in our stress tolerance. And that, if we don't modify that, then we're more likely to get depressed. What else do I want to cover? Oh, right. Repeated depressions. So depression itself is a huge stress. People who've had, there was some fantastic research done many years ago on medical students. They took a cohort of medical students and followed them up over their lifetimes. And what they discovered was that people who had at least one episode of what we call major depression, which is the kind of depression I described in the first talk that's lasted longer than 2 weeks, and it's pervasive and it's pathologically lowered. If you've had an episode of major depression in your youth even, then you are at raised risk of having a heart attack, because depression is a stress on the body. In fact, they found that the risk of having a heart attack in somebody who'd had depression who wasn't a smoker was the same as somebody who smoked 20 a day. That meant cardiovascular risk is raised by what is considered to be a mental condition. Now, my point is it's not mental, it's actually a physical condition. But what's interesting is depression itself seems to prime the brain potentially for future depressions. So it's really, really important to be quite assertive and aggressive in dealing with depression, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing these talks, is that having one episode of depression is not a trivial thing. It's a serious thing, because once you've had 2 episodes, your risk of having a third one is dramatically increased. So the idea of recurrent depression, we need to try and prevent that. And the reason is that once we get into a mood state and start thinking in a certain way, we start changing brain structure as well as function. And this is both good news and bad news. The good news is the brain is plastic. That means that, no, you're not going to melt if you stand near a fire. It means that it's moldable. It's moldable. So the brain isn't fixed. There's not much in the body that's actually super fixed. I mean, people think of your bones as being fixed, but they do alter over time as well. But the brain is alterable. So if you practice thinking positively and living optimistically and living with thanksgiving, then you will alter the physical structure of your brain. If you practice thinking angry thoughts and critical thoughts and paranoid thoughts and pessimistic thoughts, you will increase the brain's ability to do that. It's similar to exercising your muscles, which is why social media is so important. It's why people get depressed. The more you spend time in social media, the more likely you are to experience anxiety and depression. Partly because people who spend loads of time on social media, I think, are more anxious anyway. But also you are more likely to experience criticism, argument, rejection. But you are opening yourself up when you spend time on social media to negative experience. And you're also, the kind of dialogue you get into, you are practicing angry dialogue, you're practicing fearful dialogue, you're practicing, you can only go on to any social media platform, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or TwitFace, that was a joke, oh, I'm just being distracted by somebody at the door. I think it's the post. If you go on, you just see people arguing, whether it's about Brexit, whether it's about the election, whether it's about COVID. You know, people just seem to rehearse arguing and being negative and critical, and that's bad because that it's like plowing a furrow in your brain and making you more and more likely to be angry, critical, and anxious and threatened. I wanted to do another case example, then we'll finish. Now, this case example is specific to the idea that we have external stress that provokes depression, but whether that's an external stress in terms of, I don't know, a physical illness or physical injury, or whether that external stress is something that's been done to us, which has then changed the way our brains work. But then there's an internal stress that we add to it. It's our response to this stress, and it's to do with the personal meaning of it. So essentially what I'm going to try and illustrate is that we, by the way we think and behave, can amplify, can magnify the wound. So let's imagine that these external stresses that come into our lives, they're like potential wounds, like almost like a boxer coming in to punch us. You know, we are being hurt by them. But how we react to that can make it much, much, much worse. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let's illustrate it. So many years ago, I had this patient who ran a cafe business. And the cafe business got into financial difficulty. And this person got depressed as a result of that. And then they couldn't function in the cafe business, and it all went to pot and went bankrupt. And they catastrophically reacted with a really bad depression, and they were suicidal, and they were referred to me for treatment. Now we did the usual thing and checked him out for all sorts of physical illnesses. He was physically healthy, so that was good. Started on antidepressants, that was fine. But the interesting question was that he'd been absolutely fine up to the point of the getting into financial difficulty with the cafe. And so this is the interesting question. You know, if you took 1,000 cafe owners and their cafe went into difficulty, the majority of them would not get catastrophic depressed. They would cope with it and move on. So why did this person collapse to such a serious illness? Well, there was some amplification going on. There was a meaning to him which meant that it was much worse than for somebody else. So we embarked upon some cognitive therapy. And in the cognitive therapy, what came out was that he'd been brought up with a father who had not been particularly successful at work. He had a whole series of short-term jobs. The family had to move around the country as a result of that. And in fact, at one point, they emigrated to another country, and then they had to come back again. And so what this person experienced in their childhood was a father who was failing at work to provide for his family, disrupted the nurturing environment that could be provided by the two parents and his siblings. And so he experienced emotional neglect, he experienced financial stress, and there was never enough money for food and clothes, and he was significantly poorer than his peers. What he decided was that he made a vow in his heart that he would never experience that poverty, that he would provide money for his family, and he would be a success, unlike his father. And so when he failed at his business, or his business failed, he took it as a catastrophic failure, because his final statement was, "I'm just like my father." Now, why is that so terrible? Well, because actually, once you get down to that level, he was extremely angry with his father. I mean, he was actually at a deep level very angry. And so if you become like the thing that you are angry with, then that anger has to go somewhere. And so he felt he didn't deserve to live. He attacked himself. So the route out of that for him was obviously attending to getting money in, because that was such an important rule for him, but also really thinking about how his father functioned and embracing forgiveness of his father, taking his antidepressants, and changing his life in other ways. There was a complicated way out of the depression. It wasn't simple. But we can see that there was a massive internal amplification of an external stress that pushed him into depression. The final common pathway still means that we run out of monoamines in our brain, because stress is like a fire that burns monoamines. If you've got plenty of monoamines, you feed the fire, and that's absolutely fine. You cope with the stress. If you run out of monoamines in your brain, you become depressed. What we need to do is get the stress down, and sometimes we have to get rid of the amplifiers that are in our own hearts. That's where therapy is so important. Sometimes we need to help that with drugs that help the monoamine system. So that's the final case study. I'm coming to an end now. I suspect that your brains are exploding with facts. So the next talk is going to be talk number 3, and we're going to be moving less into science and more into treatment now. And the question I'll be answering is, what can we do about it? And there's 3 answers to that. We need to reduce stress in our lives, or we need to reduce the impact that is personal to us of the stress, the challenge of the stress, which is the amplifiers that I'm talking about. Or we need to increase our resilience in the face of stress. So that's going to be in the next talk. So God bless. I hope this has been helpful and that it's helped you understand things.
Change my way of thinking, make myself a difference and a rule.